My son begged me to co-sign his loan. 3 weeks later he blocked my number, and the first person to tell me what was really happening with that money wasn't my son. It was his bank. I want you to sit with that for a second because it took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand what it meant. A stranger at a call center in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho knew more about my own son's finances than I did, and she was the one who finally said the sentence that changed everything. Sir, you need to see this before you do anything. My name is Walter Hendricks. Everyone calls me Walt. I'm 64 years old. I own a precision machining shop off East Trent Avenue in Spokane Valley, Washington, a business I built with my own 2 hands starting in 1989 in a rented garage bay with 1 lathe and a loan from my father-in-law that took me 6 years to pay back. I believed for most of my life that if you worked hard and you loved your family without conditions, that love would come back to you the same way. I was wrong about that. Not about the working hard part. About the rest of it. This is the story of the worst July of my life and the one moment inside it I will remember until the day I die. Standing in a bank's back office in downtown Spokane, watching a woman slide a folder across a desk and say words that broke something open in me that I didn't know was still closed. But let me back up because none of this makes sense unless you understand where we started. I married my wife Carol in 1988. 36 years this past May. We built a life on Sunrise Court in Liberty Lake, a quiet little town just east of Spokane, right on the Idaho border. 4-bedroom house, a detached garage I turned into a workshop, a backyard that backs up to a stand of ponderosa pines. Nothing fancy. Paid off in 2019. And I remember standing on that porch the night I mailed the last mortgage payment, thinking I'd finally arrived somewhere. We raised 2 kids in that house. My daughter Renee is 30. She's an ER nurse over at Sacred Heart Medical Center downtown, married to a good quiet man named Kevin Doyle, who does HVAC work. Renee has never once in her adult life asked me for a dime. I want you to remember that because it matters. Later. My son Bradley, we call him Brad, is 33, smart, charming in a way that used to make me proud and now, looking back, makes me nervous. Brad bounced around for years, worked in restaurants since he was 19, worked his way up from user to line cook to sous chef at a decent steakhouse downtown. And for a long time I thought that was just Brad finding his footing. Every father tells himself some version of that story. Then, in early March of this year, Brad called me on a Tuesday night and asked if he and Carol and I could sit down family dinner. He said nothing serious. I should have known right then. Nothing serious is never nothing serious. He showed up at the house with a laptop bag and a business partner I'd met exactly twice before. A man named Colton Vance. Colton was maybe 38. Expensive. Watch the kind of handshake that lasts half a second too long, always smiling like he already knew how the conversation was going to end. He and Brad had worked together at the steakhouse for 2 years, and somewhere in there they decided they were going to open their own place. Ridgeline Kitchen they were calling it. A farm-to-table spot on West Main Avenue. In downtown Spokane. Exposed brick and open kitchen. The whole concept laid out on a slide deck. Brad had clearly spent weeks building. I'll be honest with you, I was moved. My son sitting at my kitchen table at 33 years old, finally talking about something with fire in his voice instead of just getting by. Carol squeezed my hand under the table. She saw it too. The number they needed was $340,000 SBA loan through Cascade Trust Bank, the branch on Riverside Avenue. They had about 60 of that from savings and a small investor, but the bank wanted a personal guarantor with credit and real collateral before they'd release the rest. Brad's credit wasn't there yet. Colton's, it turned out later, wasn't either though. Nobody said that part out loud at my kitchen table, Dad, Brad said, and I remember exactly how he said it. Quiet, careful, like he'd rehearsed it in the car. I wouldn't ask if I didn't believe in this. With everything I have, I just need your name on the guarantee. That's it. You're not writing a check, you're just believing in me on paper. Carol was quiet on the drive to bed that night. And I knew that quiet 36 years teaches you to read a silence like a weather report. Walt, she finally said, sitting on the edge of the bed, unclipping her earrings. I want to believe in him too. Do. But something about that Colton fella, I don't know. He looks at you like he's already spent your money in his head. I told her she was being protective. I told her Brad had worked in restaurants his whole adult life and finally had a real shot. And what kind of father was I going to be if I let my own hesitation be the... And he never got it. I told myself that love without risk isn't really love at all. I signed the personal guarantee on April 3rd at a conference table on the second floor of the Cascade Trust branch downtown, across from a loan officer named Diane Reyes. Professional woman, reading glasses on a chain. The kind of handshake that actually means something. She walked me through every page slowly, made sure I understood that as personal guarantor, if the business defaulted, the bank could come after my personal assets. My house, my shop, everything to satisfy the debt. I nodded along like a man who fully understood what he was agreeing to. I did not fully understand what I was agreeing to. I want to be honest with you about that because people ask. I didn't know it yet, but the next time I sat in that building, it would not be to sign anything. It would be to hear a sentence that would end one version of my life and start another. The first 2 months were good. Genuinely good construction crews in and out of the West Main Avenue. Framed permits taped in the front window. Brad texting me photos of the concrete floors getting polished. The walk-in cooler getting installed. He'd call me most Sunday evenings, walk me through the budget, ask my opinion on equipment purchases because he knew I understood machinery and I understood money. For 8 weeks, I felt like the father I'd always wanted to be. Present, trusted, needed in the right way instead of the wrong way. Then, sometime in late June, the calls slowed down. I noticed it the way you notice a clock that stopped ticking, not all at once, but in the sudden quiet where sound used to be. A Sunday went by with no call, then another. I texted him. Short replies. Busy week, Dad, talk soon. The kind of message you send when you're managing someone, not talking to them. On July 9th, I got a piece of mail at my house I wasn't expecting a notice from. Cascade Trust addressed to me is guarantor informing me that the business account associated with the loan had missed its draw reconciliation and that a payment cycle review was underway. I didn't fully understand the language, but I understood the tone. Something was wrong. I called Brad that night straight to voicemail. I called again the next morning. Voicemail again. By July 12th, I called him 9*/4 days and every single one went straight to that same flat automated voice telling me to leave a message after the tone. Then on July 14th, a Sunday, I called one more time and instead of ringing through to voice, like it always had, it went straight to a single tone and disconnected that specific sound. The sound of a number that's been blocked. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone, staring at the screen like it might change its answer if I looked at it long enough. 33 years and my son had never once hung up on me, let alone blocked me. I called Carol into the kitchen and showed her the screen and washed her face. Do something I'd never seen it do before. Go from confused to frightened in about 4 seconds flat. That's when I called my oldest friend, Frank Delgado. Frank and I have known each other since 1991, back when he ran a diesel repair shop 2 units down from mine on Trent Avenue. Frank's the kind of man who tells you the truth even when you'd rather he didn't. Which is exactly why I called him instead of just sitting with it alone. Walt, he said after I laid the whole thing out over coffee at the Denny's on Sprague Avenue. The one we've been going to for 20 years. Walt, listen to me. When a grown man blocks his father's. 3 months after that, Father co-signs a loan for him. That is not a coincidence, and you know it isn't. I don't want to believe that, Frank. I know you don't. Frank stirred his coffee slow, the way he does when he's about to say something he knows I don't want to hear. But you didn't drive out to that restaurant yet, did you? I hadn't. So the next morning, a Tuesday, I got in my truck before the shop opened and I drove downtown to West Main Avenue. Myself. I want you to picture what I expected to see. Awnings up, string lights, a soft opening banner in the window, maybe a line of people waiting for a Tuesday lunch service, because Brad had told me 2 weeks earlier they were 3 weeks from opening. What I actually found was a storefront with brown paper steel taped over half the windows. A padlock on the front door that hadn't been there in June. A dumpster out front overflowing with drywall scraps that looked like they'd been sitting for weeks, not days. No lights on inside, no sound, no sign of a single living soul. I stood on that sidewalk on West Main Avenue. For a long time, hands in my jacket pockets, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the Spokane morning air. I didn't know it yet, standing there, but the answers I was looking for were not going to come from my son. They were going to come from the one place I never expected, a phone call from a stranger who worked for the same bank I'd signed my name to 3 months earlier. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. If you're just joining me, grab your coffee. Get comfortable because this story is about to take a turn you will not see coming. If you've been with me a while, you already know what I'm about to say. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the time. Because what happened 3 days after I stood outside that empty restaurant changed the entire direction of this family. The call came on July 22nd, a Thursday at 11:40 in the morning. I was at my shop, standing over a CNC mill running a batch of aluminum housings for a client out of post, when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, Spokane area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. "I'm glad I didn't, Mr. Hendricks," the voice said. "My name is Diane Reyes. I'm a senior loan officer with Cascade Trust Bank. We spoke back in April when you signed as personal guarantor on the Ridgeline Kitchen SBA loan." "I remember you," I said, and my whole body went still in a way. "Machinery around me couldn't touch Mr. Hendricks," she said, and there was something careful in her voice. The tone of someone who's had this exact conversation before and knows exactly how much weight it carries. "I need you to come into the branch this afternoon if you're able. There are some things related to this loan that, as guarantor, you need to see in person before you make any decisions on your own." I asked her right there, standing next to a running mill with metal shavings curling onto the floor, whether my son was in some kind of trouble. She paused long enough that I heard it. "Mr. Hendricks, I'd rather walk you through documentation in person. I don't want to alarm you over the phone with half the picture." I was in my truck. 11 minutes later, I sat in that same second-floor conference room at the Riverside Avenue branch where I'd signed my name in April. Except this time, Diane Reyes wasn't alone. There was a man from the bank's fraud and risk department sitting beside her. Younger, quieter, a folder in front of him, thick enough that I felt my stomach drop just looking at it. "Mr. Hendricks," Diane said, sliding the folder toward me. "I'm going to walk you through this slowly and I want you to ask me to stop at any point if you need to." Here is what that folder told me, laid out in bank statements, draw request forms, and vendor invoices that I read 3 times each because I genuinely did not want them to be true. The $340,000 loan had been structured to release in construction draws tied to milestones. A common spa setup, permits, framing equipment build-out, opening inventory. Each draw required documentation invoices from licensed vendors signed off by both business partners. Over the course of 10 weeks, roughly $210,000 of that loan had been drawn down. But the restaurant sitting on West Main Avenue, the one I'd stood outside of 3 days earlier with brown paper still taped to the windows, had maybe $40,000 of actual work done on it. I know construction. I've spent 35 years around fabrication, and build-out costs $40,000 a visible. Progress does not eat 210. The invoices, Diane explained, had come from 3 vendors. One was a legitimate flooring contractor who had, in fact, done real work and been paid fairly. The other 2, an equipment leasing company called Timberline Restaurant Supply and a construction consulting firm called Vance Build Group, did not check out. Vance Build Group, the fraud officer told me quietly, was registered to a residential address in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Its listed managing member was Colton Vance. I sat there for a moment, not fully able to process what I was looking at. My son's business partner had apparently created a shell company using his own name, submitted it as a legitimate vendor for construction consulting, and had the bank release loan draws directly to an account he controlled. "Where's my son in this?" I asked, and I heard my own voice come out smaller than I wanted it to. The fraud officer, whose name I later learned was Trevor Okafor, turned to a specific page. "Mr. Hendricks, your son's signature is on 8 of the 11 draw requests. as co-owner that was required for release. I'm not in a position to tell you what he knew or didn't know at the time he signed them. That's not something bank records can answer. What I can tell you is that the pattern of these transfers moving straight into an account associated with Mr. Vance within 24 to 48 hours of each release is consistent with what our fraud team classifies as structured diversion. We flagged it internally weeks ago and froze the remaining undisbursed balance immediately. That's the only reason there's still $130,000 sitting untouched in that account instead of gone entirely. I want to be honest with you about what I felt sitting in that chair because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not feel rage first. I felt something closer to grief. The specific physical kind, the kind that sits low in your chest like a stone you swallowed whole. Because in that folder I wasn't just looking at fraud. I was looking at 8 pages with my son's own handwriting on them, and I did not yet know if that handwriting belonged to a victim or a participant. Mr. Hendricks, Diane said gently, closing the folder halfway. I called you in today because as guarantor, you're going to receive formal notice of default proceedings within the next 10 business days if this isn't resolved. I wanted you to understand the full picture before that letter arrives and before you make any decisions, financial or otherwise. Based on incomplete information, I've seen guarantors panic and do things that hurt them worse. I didn't want that for you. I asked her why the bank would go out of their way to do that for me. She looked at me for a moment and something in her face softened just slightly. Because you sat in that chair in April and asked me 3 separate times what happens to my house if this goes wrong. She said. Some people don't ask that question at all. I remembered you. I drove home that afternoon and didn't say a word to Carol for almost 20 minutes. Just sat at the kitchen table with my hands folded, staring at nothing while she stood at the stove, not cooking anything, just waiting. Because 36 years teaches a woman to know when silence needs room to breathe before it can turn into words. Walt, she finally said. Talk to me. I told her everything. Every page, every number, every name. I watched her face go through the same journey mine had. Disbelief, then grief, then something harder settling underneath it. That Colton, she said quietly. Told you. I told you the night before you signed. You did, I said. I'm not going to pretend you didn't. But here's what I didn't know yet. Sitting at that kitchen table on the evening of July 22nd, I didn't know where Brad actually was. I didn't know whether my son was hiding from me because he'd helped steal from his own father, or hiding from me because he was drowning in something he hadn't caused and didn't know how to face. And I was about to find out that the answer was far more complicated. And far sadder than either version I'd built in my head. I called Frank that night and asked him to meet me the next morning. Not at Denny's this time. At my shop, before the crew came in where we could talk without an audience. Frank listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, which for Frank is close to a miracle. When I finished, he sat back in the folding chair by my workbench and said the thing I needed to hear, even though I didn't want to. Walt, you need a lawyer before you need a conversation with your son. Get the facts locked down first because if you go to Brad hot whatever he tells you, you won't be able to trust it and neither will anyone else later if this ends up in a courtroom. He was right and I knew it. So the next morning, July 23rd, I called an attorney a client of mine had used for a business dispute 2 years back. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Miriam Soto with an office on North Monroe Street. I sat across from her desk and told her everything Diane Reyes had shown me. Miriam listened, took notes in small, precise handwriting, and then said something that reframed the entire situation for me. Walt, she said, setting her pen down. As guarantor, you have a right to request the full loan file directly from the bank, independent of whatever your son tells you. I'd also strongly recommend you find out where your son actually is right now, because there's a real difference under the law and honestly under any decent understanding of fairness between a business partner who helped divert funds and one who got used by someone he trusted and is now too ashamed to answer his own father's calls. I hadn't considered that second possibility with any real weight until she said it out loud. I'd been so certain driving home from the bank the day before that my son had chosen this, that he'd looked at his own father's signature on a guarantee and decided it was worth spending to fund someone else's greed. I'd built that story in 24 hours flat, And I'd built it out of hurt, not evidence. Miriam requested the full loan file that afternoon. It arrived by secure email late that night, and I stayed up until nearly 1 in the morning reading through every page at my kitchen table with a legal pad beside me, cross-referencing dates the way I would cross-reference a machining tolerance sheet. Because that is simply how my brain works when I am trying not to fall apart. And there, buried in an email chain that bank had pulled as part of their fraud review dated June 18th, was something that changed the entire shape of this story. An email from Brad to Colton, time stamped 11:47 at night. Colton. I checked the Vance billed invoices against the actual work on site and the numbers don't match up. Where is the rest of that money going? I need an answer tonight or I'm calling Diane at the bank myself tomorrow morning. Colton's reply sent 4 minutes later. Brad, calm down. It's a timing issue with supplier deposits. I'll walk you through it in person. Don't call the bank, you'll tank the draw schedule and kill the whole project over paperwork. Trust me. I sat there at my kitchen table at 1 o'clock in the morning with that email glowing on my laptop screen and something in my chest that had been clenched for 24 hours finally slightly let go. My son had seen it. My son had asked the question I would have asked. And then somehow between June 18th and the day he blocked my number, something had gone very wrong. And I still didn't know if it was fear or shame or something worse that had kept him silent since. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find my son in a place I never in 1,000 years would have guessed to look. And what I saw there would tell me more about who he really was than any bank folder ever could. Frank helped me track him down 2 days later on July 25th. Not through detective work, through his own son who still worked kitchen shifts with a few of the same line cooks Brad had come up through the ranks with. One of them mentioned casually over a beer that Brad had picked up night shifts at a place called the Whistle Stop Grill out on Sprague, a diner. Not a restaurant, a diner working the overnight fry station for cash, using a name that wasn't quite his own on the schedule. I drove out there myself at 11 o'clock at night on July 26th and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I went in because I honestly did not know what version of my son I was about to find. He was standing at a flat top, griddle under fluorescent lights, apron-stained hair, flat with sweat, 30 pounds lighter than the confident man who'd sat at my kitchen table in March with a slide deck full of dreams. He looked up, saw me through the pass window, and I watched every ounce of color drain out of his face. We stood outside by the dumpsters behind that diner for almost an hour. He cried before I did, which surprised me because Brad hadn't cried in front of me since he was maybe 14 years old. Dad, he said, voice breaking on nearly every word. I found out what Colton was doing in June. I confronted him. He swore he'd fix it. Said if I went to the bank, he'd claim I signed off on everything knowingly, that it would look like both of us were in on it together and it would be my word against his with my name right there on 8 signed draw requests. Panic. I thought if I could just find a way to cover what he took before anyone noticed, I could fix it. Quiet. And nobody would ever have to know how stupid I'd been. I picked up the night shift here to start paying it back myself. I blocked your number because I couldn't stand hearing your voice and lying to you. And I couldn't stand telling you the truth either. I didn't know how to do either one. I stood there in that parking lot on Sprague Avenue at midnight and looked at my son, exhausted, ashamed, cooking hash browns under an assumed name to try and quietly undo a disaster he hadn't caused. And I felt something shift permanently in how I understood this entire story. He was not innocent. I want to be honest about that because people ask me that too. He'd been naive. He'd been slow to act, and 8 of his own signatures sat in that bank file. Whether his intentions were good or not. But he had not conspired to steal from his own father. He had been manipulated by a man he trusted, frozen by fear of exactly the kind of story I'd spent 4 days building in my own head, and too proud or too broken to make the one phone call that would have actually helped him. I want to be clear about the next part, because it's the part that mattered most. I didn't hug him in that parking lot. I want to be honest about that too. What I did was put my hand on his shoulder, the way I used to when he was small, and I said, "Get truck, we're gonna fix this the right way starting tonight, but you're gonna tell me everything, every single piece of it on the way." The next 10 days moved fast, and they moved with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt since I first opened my machine shop back in 1989. Miriam Sato helped Brad prepare a full, documented statement for the bank's fraud division, laying out the June 18th email exchange and everything that followed. Trevor Okafor's team cross-referenced it against the shell company records, Advanced Build Group, and confirmed what we already suspected. Colton Vance had done this before under a different company name at a different bank 2 years earlier in Coeur d'Alene, with a different unlucky partner who'd simply never had the resources to fight back. On August 4th, the Spokane County Prosecuting Attorney's Office filed charges against Colton Vance for wire fraud and forgery related to the diverted draws because the bank had frozen the remaining $130,000 before it could be watched, and because Brad's cooperation gave prosecutors a clean paper trail. Restitution proceedings were open to recover as much of the missing $170,000 as possible from Colton's personal assets, which, it turned out, included a boat he'd bought in May with money that should have gone into a walk-in cooler. The bank restructured the loan as guarantor, and given the fraud findings, I worked with Miriam and Diane Reyes to negotiate the personal guarantee down substantially, tied only to the legitimately used fonts, roughly $70,000 once the flooring contractor's real invoice was verified. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't the $340,000 nightmare I'd been staring down alone at my kitchen table 2 weeks earlier either. Brad sold his car, took the bus for 4 months while he worked 2 jobs, the diner overnights and a line cook shift at a different restaurant during the day, and paid down his half of that remaining balance dollar by dollar, month by month, the way I once paid back my father-in-law for that first. I didn't pay it off for him. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I helped him understand it. I sat with him at that kitchen table more than once, going over the numbers. But I did not simply hand him a way out. Some debts, even the ones that aren't entirely your fault, are worth paying with your own 2 hands, because that's the only way the lesson actually holds. But there is one more part of this story I need to tell you. Because a story about betrayal isn't complete without the person who never once wavered. Somewhere in the middle of all this, sorting through old text messages while trying to reconstruct a timeline for Miriam, I found something I'd completely missed back in April. A message from Renee to me, sent the night after that family dinner where Brad and Colton first pitched the restaurant. I'd read it at the time, half distracted, and never really let it land. Dad, I don't want to be the minus one, but something about Colton makes my skin crawl. I've met guys like that at the hospital, family members of patients, the kind who, like a big game, and disappear the second something goes wrong. Please just be careful before you put your name on anything. Love you. I'd sent back a quick thanks, sweetheart. I'll be careful, and moved on with my night. Never once following up, never once asking her what exactly she'd seen in him that worried her so much. I called Renee on a Sunday evening in late August and asked her to come over for dinner. Just the 2 of us and Carol, no agenda mentioned. When she got there, I sat her down at that same kitchen table and told her the whole story, start to finish. And then I told her I owed her an apology I should have given her back in April. You saw this coming before any of us, I told her. And I brushed it off because I wanted so badly to believe in your brother's dream that I didn't want to hear anything that got in the way of it. That wasn't fair to you. Renee has never asked me for money in her entire adult life. Not once. Not for her wedding, not for a car. Not when she and Kevin were saving for their first house and eating ramen 4 nights a week to make it happen faster. She has a dream of her own, one she's mentioned quietly maybe 3 times in 5 years and never pushed. A small community health clinic she wants to help start one day for patients without insurance. The kind of thing she sees the need for every single overnight shift in that ER. In September, Carol and I sat down and restructured our own estate planning with Miriam's help. Not out of guilt and not to buy anyone's loyalty, because loyalty, like Renee's, was never for sale in the first place. We set up a dedicated trust, funded initially with $85,000 from our savings, earmarked specifically to help launch that clinic when she's ready, with the rest of our estate to be divided fairly between both our children once we're gone. Structured this time with the kind of protections I wish I'd understood back in April, when I told her about the trust sitting at that same kitchen table. Renee cried harder than I'd seen her cry since her own wedding day. And she told me through tears that she never once did any of it expecting anything back. I know that. I told her that's exactly why you're getting it. It's been 4 months now since that night outside the diner on Sprague Avenue. Ridgeline Kitchen never opened, not under that name, not in that space. And Brad walked away from the lease entirely. Rather than try to salvage something built on a foundation like that, he's back working as a sous chef at a restaurant downtown, saving slowly, quietly, talking now about maybe trying again someday. Smaller, simpler, with real partners he's actually vetted, and a father who'll ask a lot more questions next time before he signs anything. Colton Vance's case is still moving through the courts. Restitution has recovered about 40% of what he took so far. And Trevor Okafor tells me the fraud division has connected him to at least one more victim in a similar scheme out of Coeur d'Alene. Which means whatever happens to him now, it likely won't just be about me and my son anymore. I think about that day standing outside the Riverside Avenue branch a lot. The way I felt walking and not knowing whether I was about to learn my son had betrayed me or been failed by someone he trusted. I think about how close I came to letting 4 days of fear write the whole rest of the story before I had a single fact to stand on. Here's what I've come to understand. Sitting on that same porch on Sunrise Court most evenings now, with Carol beside me, watching the light fade behind the ponderosa pines. Love without questions isn't really love. It's just hope, wearing love's clothes, the people who deserve your trust, the ones like my daughter who saw danger coming and told me anyway, even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear. They don't need grand gestures to prove it. They just show up quietly, consistently, long before anyone's watching, and long after it would have been easier not to. My son is still my son. He made a serious mistake born out of fear more than greed, and he is still, every single week, paying the real cost of that mistake with his own. Which is exactly where it belongs. My daughter never had to prove a single thing to me, and I'll spend whatever years I have left making sure she knows that I finally see it. Some nights now, I sit at that kitchen table with my legal pad, still out of habit, and I think about Diane Reyes sliding that folder across her desk and saying the words that started all of it. You need to see this before you do anything. I've come to believe that's true of almost everything in this life. See it clearly first, then decide who deserves what. To give them if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. I will see you on the next one.